It was a gentle Tuesday morning in the village of Street Merryme. The lilacs in Miss Marple's garden had just begun to bloom, and the vicar's wife had taken to leaving baskets of eggs on doorsteps, again a sure sign of spring. Miss Marple sat comfortably in her parlor, a tray of tea beside her, and her knitting basket at her feet. She was midway through a particularly complicated cable stitch when the post arrived. The sharp flap of the letter box cutting through the quiet. With a small sigh she set her knitting aside and fetched the envelope. It was cream-colored, thick, and addressed in a neat, unfamiliar hand. Opening it with her silver paper knife, Miss Marple found a brief but intriguing note. Dear Miss Marple, I hope this letter finds you in good health. I write to you with something of a personal matter. My name is Sylvia Monteague. I am staying at Morningside Cottage, a small property I inherited from my late uncle. Odd occurrences have begun to trouble me, things that defy easy explanation. I would greatly appreciate your company, and perhaps your insight. I shall be hosting the small weekend gathering. Do consider joining us. Warm regards, Sylvia Monteague. Miss Marple read the note twice more, her brow furrowing gently. The name Monteague stirred a distant memory, perhaps connected with Colonel Monteague, who had retired to Devon some years ago after a small scandal in the Indian civil service. An eccentric family, if memory served, never one to ignore an instinct, and with a quiet thrill at the idea of a mystery stirring, Miss Marple penned a quick acceptance. She posted it within the hour. 3 days later she arrived at Morningside Cottage, a secluded stone property on the edge of Exmoor. The cottage was larger than expected, nestled among wind-blown trees, and surrounded by untamed hedge. A narrow gravel drive led to the ivy-covered entrance, and a slate roof gleamed under a sky marbled with gray. Sylvia Monteague herself was waiting at the door, a tall woman with sharp cheekbones, intelligent eyes, and a faint trace of nervous energy. Her tweed skirt and silk scarf gave her a curious airport country hostess part stage actress. Miss Marple, I'm so pleased you could come. Please come in. It's a dreadful breeze today. The parlor of Morningside was charmingly mismatched. Old floral armchairs sat beneath heavy beams, and the fire crackled as though doing its best to welcome the spring visitor. A clock ticked methodically on the mantelpiece. There are 5 of us this weekend, Sylvia explained as she poured tea with slightly trembling hands. My cousin James, my friend Clarissa Bond. She's staying a bit longer, as she's just returned from the continent. Mr. Doyle, a neighbor with a particular interest in the house's history, and Mr. Peter Willoughby, my uncle's former secretary. And you mentioned odd occurrences, Miss Marple prompted gently. Sylvia hesitated. Yes, things, misplaced footsteps, at night whispers, nothing concrete, you understand. But then a week ago I found a note in the drawing room, one I did not write, and which bore no signature. It said simply, "Justice must be done." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled with interest, but she simply said, "Oh my, how very curious." As the guests assembled that evening, Miss Marple observed each with quiet attention. James Monteague was in his 30s, broad-shouldered and affable, though his jokes seemed rehearsed. He had the hearty confidence of a man used to admiration, but his eyes shifted quickly. Never quite still, Clarissa Bond was stylish and aloof, with a shock of silver blonde hair and a Parisian scarf. She greeted Miss Marple politely, but with a kind of distracted grace, as if mentally attending a conversation elsewhere. Mr. Doyle, the neighbor, was a man in his 60s with pulsine and a passion for Roman ruins. He seemed harmless, though prone to long-winded stories about forgotten battles and weather patterns. Peter Willoughby, the secretary, was thin and watchful, with pale fingers that constantly twitched as though reaching for invisible papers. He spoke little, but watched everyone else speak with faint amusement. Dinner passed pleasantly enough, but there was a tension beneath the civility. Miss Marple noted how Sylvia flinched slightly when Peter Willoughby refilled her wine glass, how James avoided Clarissa's gaze, and how Mr. Doyle's anecdotes always circled back to the Monteague family history. Later that night Miss Marple walked quietly through the hallway toward her guest room. A floorboard creaked ahead, too light to be coincidence. She paused, waited, and saw the faintest movement, a shadow, passing the library door. The next morning brought a scream. Clarissa Bond had risen early and gone to the garden. There, behind the potting shed, lay the body of Peter Willoughby, his neck twisted unnaturally, a garden trough half buried in the damp soil. Beside him, Inspector Fletcher arrived by mid-morning, summoned from the nearest village, a practical man in a sensible coat. He bowed slightly on recognizing Miss Marple. Always seem to find you near something peculiar, Miss Marple, he said with a grim smile. Lo, Inspector, she replied mildly, you mustn't say that. I simply go where I'm Invited any ideas, he asked in a low voice, only inklings she replied. Human nature, after all, doesn't change, even in a charming cottage on the moors. She turned toward the others gathered in the drawing-room. Sylvia sat pale and silent. James paced. Clarissa stared into the fire, and Mr. Doyle examined the hearth rug with unusual interest. Miss Marple reached once more for her knitting, but her mind was already weaving something far more intricate. The shock of Peter Willoughby's death had not yet settled over Morningside Cottage. When breakfast was served the following morning, cook, a nervous local girl from Dalverton, had nearly dropped the teapot upon learning of the murder. Yet, as Miss Marple often observed, life in the countryside has its own rhythm. People grieve, certainly, but they also butter their toast and discuss the weather. In the dining room, Inspector Fletcher stood with his notebook, frowning at the somber gathering seated around the long oak table. Mr. Willoughby was found in the garden near the potting shed. He began. Cause of death appears to be a blow to the head, possibly from falling or being pushed. There are no signs of a struggle, which suggests he either knew his attacker or was taken by surprise. Sylvia Monteague clasped her teacup tightly, her knuckles pale. It's inconceivable. Peter had no enemies. He was quiet, intelligent, perhaps a little secretive, but never unkind. Miss Marple, seated at the end of the table with her laced napkin neatly folded, said nothing. Her eyes flitted gently from face to face, noting the clenched jaw of James Monteague, the forced calm in Clarissa's voice as she offered condolences, and the disinterest that cloaked Mr. Doyle like a dusty academic robe. Inspector James said abruptly, "Surely, this must have been some dreadful accident. Peter often walked about the garden. He might have slipped." Fletcher regarded him for a moment. "Possibly, but I'm keeping an open mind." Miss Marple sipped her tea and spoke delicately. "May I ask, Inspector, whether anything was found on Mr. Willoughby's person?" Fletcher consulted his notebook. "Only a notebook in his coat pocket. Odd little thing. Most of the pages were torn out, but one remained. It read simply, 'What she knows will ruin them all.'" Sylvia gasped, and Clarissa rose from her chair, visibly pale. "That's absurd. Peter didn't know anything. He hardly even spoke to us." "But he did observe," Miss Marple murmured softly. The inspector nodded at her. "Exactly, and observers are often more dangerous than agitators." That afternoon Miss Marple asked for a walk in the garden, and Sylvia, still trembling, agreed to accompany her. The two women wandered slowly past the roses, now just beginning to bud, toward the scene of the crime. "Did Mr. Willoughby spend much time here?" Miss Marple asked as they neared the potting shed. "Yes," Sylvia replied. "He always took his notebook with him, said it helped him think. He enjoyed his solitude." "Did he ever speak of your uncle?" Miss Marple inquired. Sylvia paused now, and then, "He was very loyal," said Uncle Gerald. "Was a misunderstood man." Miss Marple gently turned to face her. "And was he?" Sylvia looked away. "He could be difficult, abrupt, but I don't believe he was wicked, though. There were whispers years ago, something about a land dispute. People claimed he forced a tenant out to acquire part of their land, but there was never proof." "Whispers can linger longer than evidence," Miss Marple said almost to herself. As they walked back toward the house, a voice called from the conservatory. Mr. Doyle waved at them, beckoning Miss Marple with enthusiasm. "I was hoping to have a word," he said, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "I heard you were interested in the house's history." "Indeed." Miss Marple smiled politely. "Remarkable place, Morningside. Doyle began built in 1812, originally as a vicarage, converted to a private residence in 1875, but the real intrigue is what lies beneath." Oh, Miss Marple's eyebrows rose delicately. Yes. There are old service tunnels under the property used during the plague years. I've drawn a partial map, Peter, and I discussed it once. He believed they still connected to the cellar. Was he interested in such things? Oh, tremendously. Said there were documents hidden here. I always thought he meant diaries or old correspondence, but he hinted they could be incriminating. Miss Marple's smile faded only slightly. "Did he mention who might be incriminated?" Mr. Doyle hesitated. "No, but he once said the dead don't lie, but the papers might." Curious phrase, don't you think? Indeed. I ruined that family and others. If justice comes now, I will not complain to the executive of my will. I leave £8,000 in trust to be returned to the mere descendants, should they be found. Gerald Monteague. The silence in the room was complete. James Monteague ran a hand through his hair. "That's impossible." Clarissa looked sick. "He confessed, and no one ever knew." Inspector Fletcher read the letter twice before folding it again. "So Willoughby must have discovered this." But how? Miss Marple was quiet a moment, then said, "Perhaps he found earlier drafts, or even letters your uncle never sent." Mr. Willoughby was precise. He might have pieced it together. Sylvia sank into a chair. So Peter knew, and someone among us killed him to stop him revealing it. Miss Marple looked slowly around the room. Or perhaps, she said softly, Peter used the knowledge for something else, and it cost him his life. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the garden path. Inside, silence gave way to suspicion, and Miss Marple, with her knitting once more untouched in her lap, began to see the pattern emerge. The days at Morningside Cottage took on a new rhythm, one shaped not by breakfast and garden strolls, but by Inspector Fletcher's footsteps, hushed conversations, and doors left slightly ajar. Whispers filled the house like drafts through old stone. Everyone had a theory, and no one had an alibi that satisfied the others. Clarissa Bond withdrew. She took to her room most of the day, emerging only for meals, a silk dressing gown clinging to her frame like armor. James Montague was restless, always in motion, as if the weight of the cottage walls bore down on him. Sylvia tried to maintain order, but her voice trembled, and she checked the locks each night. Only Miss Marple remained, as she always did, quiet, observing, and knitting with steady hands. One afternoon, she took her tea in the blue parlor, a small room off the main corridor, rarely used since Gerald Montague's death. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows on the faded rug. She was not alone for long. A young maid, barely more than a girl, entered timidly, dusting in hand. Her name was Lottie, a local girl hired only weeks ago. She curtsied awkwardly upon seeing Miss Marple. Beg pardon, ma'am. Didn't realize anyone was in here. Oh, do come in, my dear. Miss Marple smiled. I don't mind a little dusting. Lottie hesitated, then continued her work carefully, wiping the corners of the mantelpiece. You've been very brave, Miss Marple said gently. The girl looked up. Startled me, working in this house, with all the unpleasantness. It's not easy. Lottie bit her lip. I didn't want to stay. I told Mrs. Montague I'd rather go, but she begged me to stay a few more days. Miss Marple nodded slowly. You were here the night Mr. Willoughby died. The cloth paused. Yes, ma'am. I was cleaning the dining room after supper. Did you hear anything? Lottie looked unsure. Not really, only I saw someone. Miss Marple's hand still go on. Well, I was going past the staircase near the back, and I caught a glimpse in the big mirror. Someone was on the landing. Only for a second. It was a woman. She had something in her hand, something white. Miss Marple frowned. What time was this? Just before 10 o'clock. I think I remember the grandfather clock had chimed once. Did you recognize her? The girl hesitated. I think it was Miss Bond. Her dressing gown's white, with them red flowers, looked just like that. Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged. Thank you, Lottie. That's most helpful. Later that day, Miss Marple asked to visit Peter Willoughby's room. Inspector Fletcher agreed, and handed her the key. The room was small and sparsely furnished. A desk stood by the window, its drawers already rifled through by the police. Miss Marple sat at the edge of the bed, her eyes wandering. Then she noticed it, a small shaving mirror, angled slightly toward the wardrobe. Odd. She rose, walked to the mirror, and turned toward the wardrobe's polished door. There, reflected dimly, was the corner of the rug, the same rug under which the inspector had found nothing. Miss Marple bent down and lifted the edge of the rug herself. Nothing at first, just the floorboards, but one board felt looser than the others. With quiet hands, she prized it up. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a sheath of papers, half a dozen pages in Willoughby's thin handwriting. She unfolded the top one and read, Memo. Montague Estate, concealed assets. But it was clear the strain had grown unbearable. Clarissa, for her part, withdrew even further, her face pale, and toward her conversations with Sylvia became clipped, formal. Whatever affection had once existed between them had been buried under suspicion and betrayal, and in the midst of it all, Miss Marple remained the calm center of the storm. She spent her time in quiet contemplation, often seated by the library window with her knitting on her lap, and her eyes half closed, but always listening. On the second evening, as the wind howled across the moor, a scream pierced the silence. Sylvia had gone to the attic to retrieve a trunk of old photographs, and returned white as chalk in the mirror. She gasped, there was someone behind me. Inspector Fletcher and the housekeeper rushed up. At once the attic was empty, but a dusty window had been thrown open, letting in the wind and rain. Fletcher frowned. Someone's trying to frighten her. Miss Marple, standing quietly in the corner, said, or perhaps someone thought she had found something. People don't panic over shadows, Inspector, not unless they believe someone's watching them. Later that night, Sylvia returned to the parlor to sit with Miss Marple. She clutched a mug of warm milk with both hands. I can't bear it any longer, she whispered. The whispers, the shadows, the sense that something awful is still coming. Miss Marple looked up kindly. There's just one more truth left, my dear. It's always the last that matters most. Sylvia swallowed. Do you think James could have done it? I think, Miss Marple said softly, that James was desperate, and desperation clouds the line between right and wrong. Sylvia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, there's something I haven't told you. Miss Marple inclined her head gently. 2 days before Peter died, I saw him in the cellar. He had something in his hand, a bundle of papers. He looked excited. I asked what he was doing, and he just said, finding the past. Then he smiled and walked away. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled faintly. That, my dear, is precisely what he did before the evening ended. Miss Marple asked one last question. To whom did Gerald Monteith dictate his final will? Sylvia blinked. Why, Peter, of course. He took it down in shorthand. Then Uncle signed it the next day. Then Peter would have known every word, Miss Marple said softly, even if the original was changed later. Sylvia's mug trembled slightly in her hands. Outside, the rain had stopped inside. Justice waited. The following morning brought a sudden clarity to the air. The rain had gone, leaving the world washed, and still Morningside Cottage sat in the hush of early light, as though nature itself were waiting. Miss Marple rose early, taking her tea alone in the library, her usual knitting untouched in favor of a slim leather notebook, the very one Fletcher had recovered from Peter Willoughby's belongings. She turned the pages, slowly reviewing the coded shorthand Peter had used. She did not read shorthand herself, but she had recognized 2 phrases scratched in the margins. Mirror truth, and he watched her change it. By the time the others gathered for breakfast, Miss Marple had sent a note to Inspector Fletcher, requesting one final search, this time of the estate solicitor's office in the nearby town of Dunbridge. The solicitor, Mr. Thaddeus Birch, had handled all of Gerald Montague's affairs. Fletcher returned by midday with news that changed everything. You were right, Miss Marple, he said, standing in the drawing room. There were 2 versions of the will drawn within days of each other. The first named Clarissa Bond as primary beneficiary. The second favored James Montague. Both signed, both dated. Sylvia's voice trembled. Which one was genuine? Fletcher shook his head. That's the question. But Mr. Birch says Peter Willoughby had brought him the revised will typed and signed, claiming it was dictated by Mr. Montague. Birch thought nothing of it. Clarissa turned to James. So you changed it? James looked stunned. No, I didn't even know about the first version. Peter must have made it up. Miss Marple set down her tea. No, Mr. Montague. I think Peter simply did as he was told by someone else. James frowned. You mean Uncle Gerald? Miss Marple's eyes glinted. I mean someone who knew Gerald was ill and confused, someone who saw an opportunity to seize control of the estate before it passed to someone they resented. She turned to Sylvia. When did you last speak to your uncle before his death? Sylvia's face fell. The day before he died. He asked me to leave the house for the afternoon. Said he had something to sort out with Peter. When I returned, he was resting. He passed away that night. Clarissa interjected. And we just accept that Gerald's sudden change of heart had no outside influence. No, Miss Marple replied. We don't. She rose slowly. Peter knew the truth. He had the original draft, and I believe he realized someone close to Gerald had tricked or coerced him into dictating a second version. He must have hesitated, uncertain whether to speak, and then someone silenced him. James Montague's voice cracked. You think I killed him? Miss Marple tilted her head. No, Mr. Montague, I think you thought you were protecting yourself from disgrace, but you weren't the one Peter feared most. She turned toward the door. Inspector, may I speak to Mr. Birch again? There's something I need to confirm later that afternoon in the study. Once again Miss Marple sat with the solicitor's letter now in hand. Birch had enclosed Peter Willoughby's final request, an unsigned, unfinished letter dated the day before his death. To Miss Clarissa Bond, one, have decided to tell you what I know. The second will is a forgery. I was persuaded, bullied into typing it, but Gerald was dying confused. He wouldn't have known. I never thought it would be used, but now it is. I'm sorry, the real culprit is the rest was smudged, the ink blurred by water or sweat. Miss Marple sat back in the armchair and said, There's your answer, Inspector. He tried to tell her he feared the consequences, and he paid with his life. Fletcher looked grim. And yet we still don't know who. Oh, but we do, Miss Marple said gently. She looked across the room, where Sylvia had quietly entered. Miss Montague, she said softly, might we take a walk in the garden? The 2 women strolled in silence until they reached the bench near the rose hedge. I've come to admire you, Sylvia, Miss Marple said kindly. You've held this house together "With grace, but I must ask you something. And I hope you will forgive my bluntness." Sylvia turned slowly, her expression guarded. "Did you know that Peter had started to doubt the will?" A pause. "Yes," Sylvia said at last. "He came to me 3 days before he died. He showed me the 2 versions, and said he didn't understand why Gerald changed it." "And did you?" Miss Marple asked, Sylvia's voice lowered. "Yes, because I was the one who asked him to." Miss Marple did not flinch. "You persuaded your uncle?" Sylvia sat down slowly. "I begged him. I told him Clarissa didn't deserve the estate, that she'd abandoned the family, that James was responsible for, but the truth is I couldn't bear the idea of Clarissa inheriting what I had spent years protecting." "So, you manipulated Gerald?" Miss Marple said gently. Sylvia's eyes welled with tears. "Yes, but I didn't kill Peter, I swear it." Miss Marple laid a hand on her arm. "No, my dear, I don't believe you did, but someone else knew what you'd done, and they used it to ensure Peter's silence." Sylvia's voice cracked when Miss Marple looked out at the moor that I intend to reveal tomorrow evening in the drawing room, and with that the trap was quietly set. It was just after 7 in the evening when the household was summoned to the drawing room. The invitation, written in Miss Marple's careful hand, had been slipped discreetly under each guest's door that afternoon. "Please join me in the drawing room at 7. I believe I can now explain what happened to Mr. Willoughby, and why yours, J. Marple." The room was dimly lit with the fire, casting a gentle warmth outside. Dusk had settled across the moors, and a chill breeze whispered at the windows. Inside, the air was taut with anticipation. Sylvia sat nearest the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Clarissa stood near the bookshelves, pale but composed. James Montague paced near the sideboard, whiskey in hand, while Inspector Fletcher leaned against the mantelpiece, arms crossed, watchful. Miss Marple, clad in her dove-gray cardigan and armed with a fresh skein of blue yarn, took the armchair at the center of the room. She did not begin until all eyes were upon her. "First," she said softly, "we must remember Mr. Willoughby not simply as a victim, but as a man who tried to do what was right even when it became dangerous." Clarissa looked away. "He discovered the truth about Gerald Montague's will. He found both versions, and realized that one had been dictated under pressure, and although he hesitated, I believe he planned to come forward." Miss Marple paused, then continued, "But someone else also knew someone who had more to lose than any of you, and when Peter began asking questions, when he hinted at revealing everything, they panicked." James frowned. "You've said all this before, but who are you accusing?" Miss Marple looked at him calmly. "Not you, Mr. Montague, though you made yourself look terribly suspicious with your behavior." His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. "I am referring," Miss Marple said, turning slightly, "to Mr. Doyle." A silence dropped into the room. Mr. Doyle blinked. "Me, that's absurd." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "On the contrary, it makes perfect sense. You claim to be merely an interested neighbor, but you knew more about this house than anyone. Tunnels, the original deed, history, even the specific family documents. You were also present the night Peter was killed, though you claimed to be at home. He straightened. "No one saw me leave." "If that's what you mean." "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "You had no alibi, and it was you who gave Peter the documents, encouraging him, I suspect, to confront Clarissa or James, perhaps even blackmail them." Fletcher stepped forward. "That's quite an accusation, Miss Marple. Do you have proof?" "I do," she said, pulling from her knitting basket a folded piece of paper. "This," she said, "was found in Mr. Doyle's own copy of a history of Somerset's houses, tucked in the hollow behind the bookshelf." She passed it to Fletcher. He opened it and read, "Allowed to be used if Willoughby refuses to keep quiet. Keep pressure on Bond and Montague. No exposure." James's face twisted. "That's not my handwriting, it's mine," Clarissa said. Suddenly everyone turned. Clarissa stepped forward, her eyes glittering. "Yes," she said, "I wrote it, but not for me, for him." She pointed at Mr. Doyle. "He dictated it. I thought we were just pressuring Peter to delay releasing the letter. I didn't think he'd go so far." Mr. Doyle raised his voice. "She's lying." But Clarissa's voice did not waver. "He promised me everything, said we could take control of the estate together, that James would be discredited. I was a fool." Sylvia stood slowly, and Peter. Clarissa's voice faltered. "He was going to speak. I tried to stop him. I begged Doyle to back off. But the next morning Peter was dead." Inspector Fletcher stepped forward. "Mr. Doyle, you are under arrest on suspicion of murder, fraud, and conspiracy to suppress a legal will." Doyle's face turned a sickly color. "This is madness. You've no proof I killed him." "No," said Miss Marple gently. but you'll find Peter's fingerprints on the envelope. And yours too, I expect." The inspector nodded to his constable at the door as Doyle was escorted out. He muttered bitterly, "All of you fools, none of you understand how power works." Silence followed his departure. Clarissa sat heavily in a chair. "He used me," she whispered, "all for a fortune I didn't even want." Sylvia looked at her for a long moment. "We used each other," she said simply, "but Peter was the only one who tried to do what was right." Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. "I often find," she said softly, "that truth is like dropped stitches. Leave them too long, and the whole pattern unravels." She smiled faintly. "But if you catch them in time, you can still mend what's broken." A week had passed since the arrest of Mr. Doyle. Spring had returned in earnest, with daffodils blooming along the garden wall of Morningside Cottage, and the hedge dotted with green. But despite the season's gentle renewal, the house still bore the memory of tragedy. The tension had lessened, to be sure. James Monteague had returned to London quietly and without farewell, leaving behind a stern note, "For Sylvia, you'll hear from my solicitor." Clarissa remained another 2 days. Her composure shattered. She did not attempt to excuse her part in the affair, only to say in her final moments at the breakfast table, "I never imagined how easily someone could talk you into becoming your worst self." Sylvia nodded, silent. On the third morning, Inspector Fletcher arrived once more, this time in plain clothes, carrying news and a brown paper envelope. He found Miss Marple in the blue parlor, as ever, with a fresh pot of tea and a half-finished sock resting in her lap. "I thought I'd give you this myself," he said, handing over the envelope. "It's from the prosecutor's office. They're building quite a case." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "I imagine they are." He sat across from her. "Clarissa won't be charged. She came forward voluntarily, and her written testimony helped tie everything together. Doyle, on the other hand, will likely face a lifetime's worth of justice," Miss Marple finished gently, as he should. Fletcher nodded. "You know, I still can't quite fathom it all, that manipulation, all those layers, and you spotted it by watching how people poured tea and walked past mirrors." Miss Marple gave a small self-easing chuckle. "Not quite as mystical as it sounds, Inspector. Just human nature. People often say what they want others to believe, but it's in what they do, what they don't do, that truth reveals itself." He looked at her, thoughtful. "You never doubted Peter Willoughby?" "Never," she said. "He was a quiet man, perhaps overly cautious, but his conscience was solid. He didn't want the inheritance or the scandal. He just wanted the truth to be heard." Fletcher leaned forward, and now Miss Marple opened the envelope. Inside were the recovered documents, both wills, Peter's notes, and the letter Gerald Monteague had written in his final days. "Now," she said, "it's time these went to the people who deserve them." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Sylvia Monteague in the conservatory. Sylvia had begun rearranging the room, planning to open it for village charity events. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her face calm but tired. "I wondered if you'd come. I brought something for you," Miss Marple said, handing over the documents. "The solicitor will know how best to proceed, but I believe Gerald Monteague intended that his wrongdoing be put right, even if it's a generation late."